Dear colleagues, please take your seats. We are trying to start this conference on time. Thank you all for coming. My name is János Zlinski, for those whom we didn't meet with personally yet, but we have now. I'm happy to be one of the members of the Balaton Group, and this is a great privilege, and this was the possibility which prompted me to ask my esteemed friends and colleagues to extend their stay in Hungary after a week of, for instance, and very, very interesting discussions to, in a way, open up a little bit to the Hungarian audience, to a wider Hungarian audience, and talk about these burning issues, these either or and type of issues of sustainability and resilience. We are very, very grateful to be hosted here at the House of Dialogue by the For Difference Academy. This is not the first event which we organize jointly. So it's great to be here again, and we are again very grateful for that. And I have the pleasure to ask Father Koronkai Zoltán, the director of the For Difference Academy, to open our conference and say a few words to you.
Gentlemen, in the name of the Hungarian Jesuit province and also the Ferenc Faludi Jesuit Academy, I would like to greet all of you who are participating on this conference. We are honored that you hold this conference here in the House of Dialogue. The topic of this conference is extremely important today. For many decades, humanity was watching the unfolding ecological crisis with inaction. The consequences of this crisis now seem to be affecting our daily life, with increasing frequency, radicality, and devastation. Every community makes its most serious mistakes when it does not try to manage foreseeable crisis in time by developing and applying the necessary solutions. No, we are here to seek together solutions. And as you formulated in your invitation letter, the goal is to look at the lens of resilience as a tool to understand and navigate future change, connect lessons to practical, near-term action. In the encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis reminds us that all human beings share responsibility for care of creation, considered by many peoples Mother Earth. Pope Francis writes that this sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of all poor. For us Jesuits, these questions are very important. After a process of discernment which involved all the Jesuits around the planet, in 2019 the Society of Jesus formulated 4 universal apostolic preferences for the next 10 years. These preferences have the goal to give directions for all apostolic activity of the Jesuit order. One of 4 preferences is to collaborate in the care of our common home. It means that we desire to work with others to develop alternative models of life based on respect for creation, to overcome the causes of environmental destruction that is inflicting an intergenerational damage. We desire to investigate and analyze, make a discerned reflection, leading to decisions that can stop the deterioration process and heal the planet. In the last decades, the collaboration became also more important for us Jesuits. We are convinced that we need to work together with others. We are all collaborators in unique mission of Christ. Our universal apostolic preferences call us to deeper understanding of our call to be collaborators in the mission of Christ, entrusted to the church we are part of. And even more, we would like to work together, all people with goodwill, independently of their religious or political convictions, for the common good. We are convinced that if we serve other people, especially the poor, if we protect the planet, then we work mysteriously together with the Lord, who, according to our Christian faith, is the creator and life giver of all of us. Our task to care of our common home, even to save our planet, is a challenging one, especially today. Our present way of living is no more sustainable. We need an ecological conversion, as already St. John Paul II formulated. And Pope Francis encourages us in Laudato Si to seek a sustainable and integral development. For we know that things can change, says the Pope. The Creator does not abandon us. He never forsakes his loving plan or repents of having created us. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. We require a new and universal solidarity. Everyone's talent and involvement are needed to redress the damage caused by human abuse of God's creation. All of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvements, and talents. So these are the encouraging words of Pope Francis. With these thoughts, I would like to wish you a blessed common work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Concrete. Thanks again for having us here. I have the honor now to convey a message to the conference from Dennis Meadows, one of the authors of Limits to Growth, who could not be present personally here at this event, but was or is kindly sharing some thoughts to this seminar. So this is the statement by Dennis Meadows to introduce the seminar from sustainability to resilience. I cannot join you for this very interesting and important seminar this afternoon. Therefore, I thank János for sharing with you my thoughts on the meeting. I still remember 50 years ago, on March the 2nd, 1972, preparing to deliver the first public report on our research project for the Club of Rome, the Limits to Growth. I was embarrassed because I feared that I would be wasting the time of many important people by telling them things they already knew. I planned to tell them the three main ideas of our study. One, physical growth cannot continue forever on a finite planet. Two, delays in perceiving the problems of growth mean that humanity will overshoot the limits for a sustainable global society unless action is taken before the limits are clearly seen. And our main conclusion If the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. I worried for no reason. Those many important people did not know and did not accept my ideas 50 years ago. And most leaders still do not accept them today. Nevertheless, any objective consideration of the current global situation shows that our study was basically correct. Global limits have been reached, and now humanity has entered a period where it will have to bring its collective demands for resources back down below the carrying capacity of planet Earth. There are many definitions of the phrase sustainable development, but none of the generally used meanings any longer offers us a feasible goal. The planet has absolutely no possibility of sustaining the current global population and the current global material consumption standards. I am unhappy about the fact. I consider it grossly unjust for those who are still poor. I would change it if I could, but I cannot, and no one can. Humanity's priority must no longer be to slow down, but it must become to get back down. Our analysis 50 years ago focused on physical limits to physical growth, and it gave useful perspectives for developments over the past 50 years. They were a period of searching for sustainable development. The future will be governed by political and physiological forces very different from those included in our model. Thus, Word 3, the model, does not give useful insights for the future, because the future will be a period of searching for resilient development. And the search will be by people like the people in this room. I remember one afternoon in the 1980s, flying down the surface of the Danube on a Soviet hydrofoil from Vienna. As we passed under Margit Bridge, the Statue of Liberation came into view, and I asked my Hungarian friend what it was. He explained and then said, the good news is that Hungary is always being liberated. The bad news is that it's never by us. Since then, you have liberated yourselves. After 1,000 years as a nation under the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Austrians, the Germans, the Soviets, Hungary is free to plan its own future, its own role within the global community. No one yet knows how to do that. I do not know how society will appear by 2050. I do know it will be enormously different from today, politically, environmentally, economically, and socially. Global climate will be more adverse, energy more expensive, food more scarce. Global political alignments will be drastically different. We can foresee already a number of problems that will confront all regions: aging population, changing climate, depleting resources, surging migration, rising debt, expanding gap between the rich and the poor. Solutions that address these problems in one culture will not be perfect in another. But from others' efforts, you can gain ideas about what might work in Hungary. This seminar is a wonderful opportunity to do that. It brings 4 people I greatly respect to share perspectives on resilience from 4 different continents. No country will be able to avoid the problems that are coming. But if you find new ways to increase the resilience of the people and institutions in Hungary, you will be able to sustain your most fundamental values. The Hungarian people have endured for over a millennium. adapting again and again to changes imposed on them from outside. With you and others, they can find a way to negotiate the changes imposed by limits to growth. I wish you every success this afternoon in your efforts to do that. Dennis Meadows. And now, after having spiritually or mentally Dennis among us, I have the pleasure to turn to our colleagues who are physically also among us from the Balaton Group. Thank you all for coming. I will introduce you one after the other, but we were trying to give a tiny bit of information about everyone in our invitations so that you have a chance to get an impression or get a little bit acquainted with them in advance. And so, without much ado, I will ask my dear friend Justin Raby to come and share a few experiences in resilience building for social capital. Justine is a Namibian-born colleague, scientist, social activist, and she had a lot of work in that country on the west coast of Africa, and now she's on the west coast of Mexico, continuing her efforts. And we want to hear from her, in a way, some examples of social projects and how they reflect to resilience. I could say that we start with a case study, so to speak. Justin, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Janos, for introducing me. And we were going to do this kind of sequence of talks a little bit differently. And unfortunately, I have to jump on a plane this afternoon, so we're turning it around a little bit, which means that you're going to hear quite concrete, on-the-ground examples of building resilience, and then move upwards into kind of framing resilience and worldviews. So I included a very strange picture here just to show how beautiful Namibia is, but also to kind of bring resilience into kind of the natural background too. So this is a desert landscape, and it deals with adaptation quite a lot. And this was one of those times where this is in the 80s, I grew up in a Skeleton Coast Park, which is a desert coastline desert area in northern Namibia, and it goes through periodic droughts, and this lion had to find another way to find its food. So this is one of those very rare cases where you find a lion actually eating a whale carcass on the beach because it couldn't find food inland. And this photo ended up on the National Geographic cover in the 80s, 1983. Yeah, it's an old photo, so it's not the best quality. Anyway, so I'm gonna give you a couple of examples. I've been working on kind of the nexus or the link between sustainable development and resilience for about a decade. Most of that has been in Namibia. And while I agree with many things that Dennis says, I can't accept that we will leave people behind. And I think there are quite a number of countries, me being part of one, where we can still do development that includes resilience, but also thinks differently about what development really means and what it means in terms of progress and what it means in terms of quality of life for people and how to build resilience into that. So I'm just going to start with kind of my conclusions and then work backward from there. So some of the key conclusions or messages I've had from work in this area has been that top-level stuff is usually very difficult to do. And when I've been working at the community level, I've managed to get a lot more done. and the communities have inspired me, and that kind of trickles up most of the time instead of the other way around. And I'll give you some examples of both. So decentralizing decisions, if there's any takeaway messages from this presentation, I hope that these would be the ones. When we're facing a lot of shocks, and we're going to be in the years to come, the kind of strength of the community that you're in is really going to be a very key aspect to how resilient you are. And so decentralizing those decisions and agency to the community level, and I'm talking like level of neighborhoods and villages, that really gives power and allows people to actually organically create resilience. And taking action at community level, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, and demonstrating this action in such a way that others are inspired. And then you kind of scale this resilience. And the most important thing, if there's one word that I think anyone should capture from my presentation, it's trust. So that's something I've picked up from all the work I've done, is if there's no trust in the system, and even people have told me this along the way, if there's no trust, then you're not going to get anything done. So I'm going to give a few examples and case studies from two very different countries, but they have some similarities. So I come from Namibia, which is a country in Southwest Africa, and about 3 years ago, maybe a few months before COVID happened, I moved to Mexico. And I've been doing quite a bit of work under, as you all know, quite limited and challenging circumstances over there. So I'll give examples from both. I think they illustrate a nice kind of mix. So I'll start with Namibia. So those of you who don't know much about Namibia, it's a country that's called a middle-income country, but it has a very high rate inequality, and we're still kind of developing in every sense, so in terms of infrastructure capacity and our economy in general. So I started, or I didn't start, in parallel, I was working in various high levels in the political kind of decision-making platform. So I kind of climbed my way up into eventually sitting on the panel advising the president of Namibia in 2019 and 2020. And we, managed to discuss a lot of ways in how the economy can kind of transform in such a way that it enhances resilience and develops. And to understand what kind of development we want for the country, because Africa is in a very unique position, or many countries in Africa are, in a way that they can leapfrog and kind of leapfrog especially infrastructural type development in such a way that they can be kind of ground resilience into the infrastructure. But we're not really doing that right now. We're kind of copy and pasting a lot of development models from the north. So, so when I started this 10 years ago, we started with very basic questions of like, what does progress actually mean? And what does a good quality of life actually mean? And then work from there, so we know what we need to kind of think about when we're thinking about developing a nation. And so we did, I don't know, is there a clicker? Can I use this? No? I've moved on. So I'll just use my, so if you look at that, there is one of the papers that we published where we actually went out into the different neighborhoods of a capital city, and we found out what does well-being, we had all these different indicators, and this was actually a project that started out with some people at the Balaton group, so there's a connection there. But we tried to find out what do people value, what is important, what are their needs, and then work from there. So we had a lot of work around that, everything from depth dialogue processes to surveys on the streets, and we published a bunch of different articles, but also policy papers and so forth. And then at the same time, we ended up on kind of these more African well-being economy type of action networks where we discussed all the countries around Africa and how we can kind of integrate this kind of way of thinking. Instead of GDP growth, actually say development and growth for whom and for what. And then knowing what kind of shocks we're going to be facing coming in, what kind of resilience can we build into the system. And so, long story short, I ended up on this panel and we tried to move a couple of things in terms of leapfrogging certain sectors like energy, transport, decentralizing the energy system, for instance, so there's not so much dependence on the central grid. And a country like Namibia is very rural, so there's a lot of decentralization needed anyway. So there's a lot of work that we did around that. Like I said, we went into testing alternative indicators to GDP, worked with the National Statistics Agency, and then even did some system dynamics modeling, very basic work on finding leverage points at national level to inform decision making of where the key gaps are and how one can think about education, energy, water infrastructure, and so forth, and how one can develop the country in a smart way so that, in 20 years from now, it's a robust, resilient nation. And then most importantly, something that we really tried to push was universal basic income. And we've had some of the best test cases in Namibia, in the world, actually has been done in Namibia on this. I don't know if, I assume most of you know what universal basic income means, but it's basically income for everyone, a minimum amount. And in a country like Namibia with a high inequality and a high poverty rate, it had amazing tests, like test results in the villages where it was tested, like villages transformed to really resilient kind of micro economies grounded in more well-being and not in growth. I had limited success in this platform. So some of the stuff worked, most of it didn't. And we are still on the kind of growth trajectory in Namibia. So I'm sure some of the stuff kind of got embedded, but there is still a very strong growth-obsessed model that kind of follows the neoliberal way of thinking of how to grow a country. And so we're still very kind of GDP-obsessed and kind of make the pie bigger so that it'll trickle down to the people, even if at the moment the current pie still is limited to very few people. So I don't know, so this is where over the many years I had very limited kind of, if I was going to look on an indicator framework and say like how much success did we have in terms of building resilience at the national level, I would say very close to zero. And so let's look one step down, lower. So this is an example in a town where we had the opportunity to transition a mining town into kind of a sustainable, resilient, diversified economy. And we had workshops and depth dialogue processes and all sorts of activities over a number of years as this big diamond mine that kind of controlled the entire economy, or everyone was dependent on it in this town, was actually running out of resources and leaving this town. And so how are people going to sustain themselves when this kind of resource comes out or runs out? And so there was a lot of kind of, let's get the community together, let's get all residents together over a series of a couple of years and discuss how one can shape this town in a way that is sustainable and speaks to the needs of the people. And so there's all sorts of work around like how are we going to manage water, food markets, can we grow our own food? It runs close to a very permanent water river, one of the only ones. We only have 2 permanent rivers in Namibia. And how to do that in a sustainable way. And there were all sorts of ideas. There's one little flip chart of a bunch of people sitting together and really planning this at kind of a community level, because it's a small town. And this is still work ongoing, so I can't speak too much to the success of that. But small towns, there's generally, when one can get everyone together in a good way, it works better in terms of the trust, especially if the town has had like a long history with the same kind of generations over a long period of time. So everyone knows each other and you can work quite well, but at the same time there's also other kind of social issues that complicate that. So this is where we started having the real success, and where I can say real resilience was built, and in a kind of incremental way. So when we were going and working in doing the surveys and finding out what a good quality of life is, we went into various regions around the capital, various suburbs around the capital of Windhoek in Namibia, and Shandambala and Sonderwater were one of them. It's not the lowest income area, it's about the middle, but I'm talking in the line of, lowest income where people don't even have access to water infrastructure, or sanitation, or, road infrastructure. So, and we live in shanty town. So this is a built environment with the local government set up, and we went in there with the results of the survey, because we had surveyed this area and had interviews and depth dialogues and so on with people in this area, and some of the people that I work with live there. So we thought this is a good low-hanging fruit, we already have connections in there, and we started opening up dialogue about what is missing here, we did visioning, like what would you like this community to look like in 30 years from now? What are the key things that you care about? And then let's see how we can start building a way to get there. And there were quite a number of things that came to the forefront in this, including safety, education, an informal settlement right on the corner that was living in shanty towns that they wanted to deal with, and because a lot of the safety and crime was coming from the kind of connection between these two communities, or these two suburbs, and then trust. Interestingly, I put that picture on over here where people were kind of voting what was most important once they had listed what are the key things, and trust came up as the most important, even before, sometimes even before basic needs, which was very surprising. So we had these we were just facilitating, but those who were living there in the community, they formed part of these committees. And everyone kind of within the community was able to sign up to these committees. They signed up to various committees, and they started working on action plans together with the local councillor, and then seeing how they can connect funding sources to the action that they're doing. And then this informal settlement I was just mentioning formed its own committee with some champions on the ground that lived there, and we worked on building a little bit of a well-being economy, kind of a resilience building test case there, and this is where people deal with all sorts of issues. A lot of them were living in plastic housing or tin housing. It's not even housing, it's literally just structures. Didn't have access to water, were actually illegally settled there, so there was land tenure issues. And through negotiations, kind of connecting the city of Windhoek with the local councillor and the people there, we managed to get basic infrastructure in there. We managed to get, some people were able to get materials and kind of repurpose into housing. Created a small kind of connection between carpentry trainers and people, young men who were unemployed, and connecting that to training to actually start building, creating furniture business, which actually is still going and went relatively well. And then community gardens. So they did quite a lot of work around kind of what kind of community gardens can you set up that provide food, especially in a desert kind of environment. And so a lot of that built the resilience of this community, but also lifted the community up and gave more choice and more potential to do more, because basic things were being covered, but at the same time, the community was kind of building cohesion and trust, and then safety kind of was affected at the same time on the other side in Shandambala. And funny enough, they also had little savings, group savings between themselves, so that during COVID, they were able to support each other and actually buy food that they could share. So that ended up being quite a nice example of resilience at a very small scale for a community of about 100 people. We also do a lot of, the topic of resilience and sustainability is not an easy one, and important to get people to understand kind of the trajectory of the world and kind of the decisions we're making are kind of leading us into a kind of scary space vis-a-vis also what Dennis, the introduction that Janos gave for Dennis. This is all very real stuff, and this is all very scary, and this is, you know, all needs to be dealt with and needs to be understood, and people need to kind of collectively come together around this. And so we spend quite a lot of work around communicating resilience and sustainability and how to do that, and educating especially young upcoming students, professionals, but also open to anyone who would kind of come, using gaming as a tool to communicate and educate people around complex things, such as, you know, food systems, or climate change, or risk management. So I'm happy to chat about that a little bit more, but I thought I'd just throw that in. And they usually have very good dialogue processes around it and create safe spaces where people can really engage with it. And so we did a lot of that, and we've been doing it over about 4 or 5 years now. So that's all Namibia. I'm going to jump into, and then I moved to Mexico and started working over there. And joined an NGO that works on watershed management, and I think this is a very interesting case. It's also quite local and quite community-oriented, but that speaks to looking at the entire watershed, but then kind of brings in these different thematic areas from watershed management, which is manejo de cuencas, and then social capital, how to build that, sustainable economies, biodiversity protection, and, you know, these kind of flagship projects that we do. So we work in the kind of similar things that I was doing in Namibia, but focused on water and restoration of ecosystems to be able to provide water to the cities. So the idea is, if you have a healthy ecosystem, you will also have healthy drinking water. That's the basic concept. And that's the kind of work that they're doing. So Mazatlan, I don't know how many of you know about Day Zero in Cape Town in South Africa, where the city ran out of water. And those are kind of things that we're probably going to face on an increasing basis. And Mazatlan has similar problems. So there's a lot of water wastage, a lot of water use, and a lot of like, well, I believe if the tap is there, I just turn it and water will keep coming out. But there's so much infrastructure and so much kind of bad development, mining, fertilizer production, and so on, and also deforestation and kind of unsustainable land use and management, that water either gets clogged up in the system, or there's more and more kind of droughts, or the water just floods and creates erosion, and there's no water that actually gets to Mazatlan, or it gets to Mazatlan dirty because of the kind of infrastructure that's developed, and because there's so much kind of deforestation that, you know, where the dam wall kind of has been built, there's so much silt and sand and stuff that builds up that they have to kind of build the dam wall higher and higher, and all of that ends up going into the water piping. So there's a big project around that, to how to like really do proper reforestation, actually use green infrastructure, working with people who live there and farmers, and changing that kind of mindset to kind of create more resilience in the water system, especially because this area is going to face more and more severe droughts. And then kind of brought a couple of things with me with the community gardens that we started doing in Namibia, and learning from neighbors building resilience through community gardens, composting, and then these kind of social structures that come with it at that level in Mazatlan. And one of the reasons, I didn't say this random jump from Namibia to Mexico was part of the learning that I wanted to experience, and how to learn how different people deal with resilience and sustainability in completely different parts in the world and different cultures. And so it's been that process that I've been working on and learning from over the past 3 years in a completely different country. So this is just a very simple example. This is something I'm personally involved with in my neighborhood, in the place where I'm living in Mazatlan. But those, to me, from the top level down to the community, I really believe, like I had said before, that taking action at the community level is really the easiest way to create resilience relatively fast. And that might mean creating saving schemes. Depends on community to community, but creating the things that have worked in my experience have been things like creating community saving schemes, and they don't even need to be savings in terms of finances. They can be savings in terms of working together for different things, simple trade, time, skill sharing, etc. Time banks have become more and more popular. And then decentralizing things like water, food, and energy down to the community level as much as possible, focusing on health and well-being, and not necessarily looking at health as in I'm sick and I need to go to the doctor, but actually how are we looking after each other and ourselves in the community in terms of our lifestyles, how we eat, what we eat, and how we live, so that we don't have to, so that your immunity is built. And then community cohesion, like I said, that comes in with trust, and the more you build that and you work together and you do these things and you fail together and you come up together again, that is really an important kind of glue for building resilience. And then the more one has kind of these successes and demonstrates this, I've seen this not only in my own countries, but having evaluated various other projects around Africa and Asia and Central and South America, is that the more you see something, you see your neighbor doing something, the more you actually learn and you're inspired to do it yourself. So that kind of upscaling and cross-scaling, I've seen also be quite dependent on how much this kind of solutions are demonstrated. And as I said before, the most important thing is trust. And that is also a hard thing to build, but it's kind of the key word that has kind of come across all of this, even at the national level, and all the community work that we've managed to do successfully and unsuccessfully in some parts. Thank you.
Justine, as we said before, and Justine also reminded you, she's unfortunately dashing away around the coffee break. So here is the opportunity. I mean, you know from the program that we'll have a sort of a wider discussion space at the very end of this conference, and there are, of course, possibilities for immediate questions to the presenters like now. But Justin will not be with us at the very end of the conference. So this is the more important that we have now. We have now this time space before the next talk. So any questions to what you have just heard from the audience? I have a page myself with questions, but I wanted to ask the audience first. Yes, please. I give you the mic.
Thank you, Justine. Justine, is it easy to activate people, to motivate them and to invite them to work together and to build that trust you mentioned? Thank you.
You can use that one, actually, yes.
I don't? Hello?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Good question. It's not easy at all. It depends very much on how much organic stuff comes from the community themselves. I mean, like I said, when we work with people who are already living in the community, when I'm in the part of the community, then it's much easier because you already have that kind of presence and you are part of something. But if you come from the outside, especially if you are different in any way, like you're a foreigner or you're not the same tribe, or then the trust is already quite low, and you really have to build that. It's not impossible, it's just hard work and trial and error and determination.
But how do you begin then? I mean, that's a very good question.
How do you get there?
Yeah, I mean, you're coming in from the outside with an idea, you know, so.
So it's, again, that depends very much on the context, but for this, the Sonderwarte community, and then specifically when we kind of started building up, first we had people who were already kind of living close by, so there were some people who were known and who grew up in that community or had friends and family. Myself, I usually put a lot of emphasis on the kind of dialogue you create coming in. So first, creating spaces for safe dialogue and listening, like deep listening. There's actually some really great dialogue kind of literature or books and research that talks about trust building and creating depth dialogue or depth facilitation processes where you get to the bottom of kind of deeper feelings, whether it might be, you know, some places are even in conflict or have like really deeper issues or symptomatic issues like drug addiction and so on. That's also part of some of these communities. So there's a lot of things that you have to kind of untangle and you might not be able to fix. But to answer the question, those kind of dialogue spaces, and then actually being there and doing the stuff with people and not just coming in and kind of, here's money or here's the tools, but actually being part of the process from start to finish and being there and also protecting them, being there to negotiate. Like when we had negotiation with the mayor of the city of Windhoek, or, you know, you kind of, the voice, you empower the voice, but where you, like it's not possible, you know, stand for them, stand up for them. That makes sense.
I wanted to ask, you know, going back to the beginnings, you said that in Windhoek you started with very basic questions like what is well-being, what are your goals, what is important. Were these open questions, or was that a sort of a questionnaire, or did you just approach them with completely open questions and they had to formulate what they wanted to say?
So that's also quite a long, a long process. So in 2012 we started with this, and we actually used various indicator frameworks. We based it on, I think, the gross national happiness. This was in 2012, so it's quite a while ago. Gross national happiness, and they have, and then there's also a couple of questionnaires that kind of base it on that for Seattle. So there were these questionnaires that ask, like, you rate on a scale, and there's different domains. So we talk about governance, and we talk about health, and we talk about education, you know, the health of the environment, and so forth. So there's all these different domains, and then people were asked to rate them, and you walk them through the questionnaire. So we did that, ran surveys. We also did deep interviews, so we did superficial interviews, we realized that didn't work, then we did to kind of find the narrative, not just the indicators, quantitative indicators, but actually also get a narrative from people and understanding, a story of what progress or what a good life means. And of course that's a changing concept, but it's important to kind of get the essence of that. So we had really very deep dialogue processes again about that, because we realized just superficial interviews, you're not going to get to the deep stuff. And we also did work on the genuine progress indicator, which is an alternative to GDP, and that was with the National Statistics Agency. So we kind of covered quite a number of different angles.
And are those indicators actually on the Namibian official indicators?
So that's where the kind of where the limited success came in. We had really good dialogue. The well-being, kind of the stuff that we managed to publish, that got a lot of traction, and the depth dialogue and the kind of videos and the communication we did around that got quite a lot of traction. But when it actually came to decision making to make the change, or even NSA, I'm saying the National Statistics Agency of Namibia, them actually running it, you know, then we're talking about national budget allocations, staff, and so on. So when we were doing it with them, there was interest, but we couldn't ever get the political will to really push this.
Yeah, to put it up officially. I'm looking at the clock, but a last question would be leading over to Anupam, actually. You talked about resilience being, this term was coming up, that we saw very concrete work with these communities, but in a way, you said that this would have made them in one or the other way more resilient. What resilience features would have sort of appeared in those communities, or you know, how could we get one step closer to them in this respect? That why were they more because we know that they were better off financially, or they were more safe having water, or they were closer to the political process. But what would you say? Why would you say they came out from the process more resilient than they went into?
Yeah. All of these things might sound like just access to basic needs, but without those things to begin with, you're vulnerable. So anything will come, you're not even going to be able to feed yourself, right? So we're talking about communities in this sense, like Sunavasa as an example, that was already super vulnerable just in a normal circumstance. So building the community cohesion and actually having proper structures in place just for living, and then also creating kind of in the group social saving schemes, having sort of small micro businesses and community gardens already kind of creates a little bit more of a decentralized approach. So you're not that dependent on, you know, food coming from somewhere else, for instance, or you have better structures in place if there is, for instance, a flood. If you have a drought, you know, you have, I'm talking about climate resilience in this instance, you have, you know, your water system already set up in such a way that you don't need very little water, and you have desert adapted plants, you know, crops to feed yourself. And then, you know, these kind of saving schemes and the social cohesion that you build, this is kind of the core of what I was kind of talking about. That might seem, you know, obvious, but it's not. Like, I think we live in societies where, you know, you might not even know your neighbor, and we're trying to rebuild that with communities like that. You know, if something happens to one person, everyone looks out for that person. So the community is a bit more solid, and people look out for each other. So when someone is struggling, the other person jumps in. And that kind of community structure is a lot more resilient to a shock than a community that's separated or too individualist.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much, Justine. We'll go over to the next presentation, but I ask everyone to sort of remember the word vulnerability, because in a way you can look at something from the back side. You can look at the rug from the back side of it. So being vulnerable means that one is not resilient. So this is the two sides of the same balance. Now we want to one step closer to the resilience concept. So I ask Anupam Saraf, please, Anupam, help us to sort out a little bit what resilience is, what it isn't, and what matters in this issue. What would make a system resilient, and what would make it vulnerable? Anupam is a systems analyst from India, but again, he is not just a theoretical, an excellent theoretical person, but he's been actually instrumental in saving Indian rivers and basically bringing them back to life, including the communities along the river and relying on the river. So here's again a very interesting combination of actually being there in action and knowing your science. So Anupam, please.
Very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Janos, for inviting me here, and it's indeed a great honor and pleasure to be with you. And I'm grateful for all of you to spend this time to come and listen to the few thoughts that I want to share with you. I feel somewhat like what Dennis expressed in his address to all of you. I feel embarrassed to be here because I feel much of what I will tell you is what you will already have known. But I'm going to simply try and lead you through the lens of systems to look at the world around us that we experience. But before we go there, a little bit of context. I think most of you would have at least read a few chapters from The Limits to Growth. I'm just going to summarize that very briefly. So I think the key points that the world model constructed by Dennis and Donella Meadows and their colleagues at MIT, led by Jay Forrester, indicated that the population of the world is increasing exponentially. And so I think most of us have seen that in our own lifetimes, the population of the world has either doubled or tripled depending on how old we are. It's almost a sign to say how old we are getting. So in a sense, as the population increases, we start using the world's resources. And as we start using these world's resources, they start decreasing. And at the same time, because we are exploiting these resources, we find that there is an increase in pollution. And so they indicated that there is a feedback mechanism, which, and I'm simplifying in order to compress it into a few minutes, that because of this feedback mechanism, either we have insufficient food per capita, resulting in malnutrition and deaths, or we have the effects of pollution, which can also cause deaths. And so the population which had been growing exponentially, and as happens with any life form which is growing in a limited resource, it grows in an S-shaped curve, or it grows exponentially and then collapses. So the world model had several scenarios to try and explore how we could continue to thrive on this planet, despite the fact that, we are growing. The first time when I met Donella Meadows, and which was not very far from Budapest, I met her for the first time in, I think, 1986 at IASA in Vienna. She was on a sabbatical, and I was traveling through there before coming to spend a month in Budapest. So I have very fond memories from 1986 of this lovely city. So the first question that I really asked Dana Meadows was that I have read your Limits to Growth, and I would like to know what I can do in order to make one of the better scenarios happen. And what can policymakers do in order to make a better scenario happen? What are the places where I can intervene? What are the systems which I need to understand in order to be able to know that they will make a difference to the world? And Dana Meadows was an extremely wise person and a very patient person. So she looked at me for a moment, and then in a beautiful smile, she said, "Anupam, what a brilliant question. What will you do? What can you do?" And ever since that day, I started my journey of asking this question to myself over and over again. And so I'm going to lead you through part of that journey of what I have discovered since 1986 by looking at the world around me from the lens of systems. And I'm sure many of you would have walked the same path, and maybe you see some familiar things and maybe some not so familiar things. Can you? Thank you. So the first challenge that we all face is that we don't know what our systems are, because we don't know what is included and we don't know what is excluded. And when we don't know that, we don't know whether the system that we are talking of is the same system that the others are seeing. And this is the biggest challenge we have when we discuss about the world around us. We don't know where we are drawing a boundary. We don't know why this system exists and who actually created the system, or how can we sustain it. With these challenges, we have to all go through the process of trying to navigate our way through this world. So in India, and I'm sure in other cultures, we talk about the third eye. And the third eye is supposed to be located between our two eyes. And it's, I think Bert will probably tell you better, that it is one of the chakras that we have in our body. In some ways, it opens up our perception beyond just seeing. And it also ensures that we can transcend our egos to recognize that we are part of something which is larger than us. So our identity and our essence is beyond our own. So we are one is something that you recognize when you see through the third eye. And it also therefore helps us to make a connection with the universe. And in some sense, I feel that the science of systems is like the third eye, because it helps us to see beyond ourselves, and it helps us to see ourselves as a part of the whole that we make up with the others who are part of the system. So I'm going to lead you through this third eye journey, which helps us to navigate through the systems. So I think you will recognize that when we interact with each other, we create a system. And this is a familiar system that you would have all experienced right from the first time that you went with your parents to a market. When buyers and sellers come together and interact, we create a market. It's a system. Sometimes we don't describe it as buyers and sellers, but rather as demand and supply. And of course, then we have lost out the people. And we have lost out the connection. And we have lost out the fact that the market is one when the buyer and seller are together. It's not the buyer separately, it's not the seller separately. So we need to sustain the market if the market has value to us. It has to have value to the buyer, it has to have value to the seller. And a corollary to this is that systems are everywhere. So just as this is a simple market that we all experience every day, we experience many other such interactions that we have in the real world. As borrowers and lenders, we create banking systems. As learners, we create educational systems. When we forget who have come together, we stop recognizing systems. Why do we interact? We don't just interact for the sake of interaction. There is always a purpose to our interactions. And when there is a purpose to the interactions, it is that purpose which really drives what we are doing. And it's important for us to realize that systems serve the purpose of those who interact. In this case, it's a judicial system where you have people who are seeking justice, who go to people who deliver justice. And therefore, if the purpose of Those who seek justice is to seek justice, and the purpose of those who give justice is to give justice, then it will work as long as it serves the purposes of those who have come to interact. If it doesn't serve that purpose, it will stop being the system that it's meant to be. Then I want to highlight that our interventions result in what we experience as behavior from the system. So what we experience, whether it is exploitation, whether it is harmony, whether it is trust, whether it is mistrust, whether it is violence, whether it is abuse, whether it is scarcity, it is a result of our interactions. It's not just magical that it happens to be that there is scarcity in the market. It's a result of our interactions, our interventions in the system. And so therefore, it's important to recognize that it is our purposes, because they drive the interactions, which are responsible for the behavior of the system. So very briefly, if we were to look at these properties of systems, then the behavior of the systems result from the interactions of those who participate in the system. That's one of the most fundamental things to remember. And I'm sure, we experience systems every day and every moment of our lives. It's almost like breathing. We never pause to think about what a magical thing it is and how it really works. It's about thinking. We think all the while, but we don't pause to think about how we think or what a magical thing it is. So systems are similar. So in the same way, when we look at interactions that are driven by purposes that bring participating actors together, and systems are sustained by actors who are interdependent. So if there is no interdependency, the system may not be sustained. It's important to recognize that. And altering the actors in their purposes alters the system and its behavior. So when you actually change the purposes of the actors, it will change the behavior. So I think it's important to recognize that these are all properties which arise from the interactions that we have with each other. These are not properties of us as individuals. So systems, in jargon, we call this as emergent properties. These are properties that emerge because we interact with each other. So I'm going to go through a few things to relate this to resilience. So resilient systems do not alter their behavior despite our intervention. So even though we try hard to intervene, somehow these systems do not seem to change. They are resistant to change. And sometimes this is good, and sometimes this is not so good. So if you have a system which is oppressive, which is exploitative, and you want to change it, and with all your interventions, it doesn't change, then there is a problem. So there are so for example, for 2 years or more than 2 years, many of us experienced this great phenomena called pandemic. And we were all locked into our houses. And no matter what we tried to do, we could not, all our interventions could not change the fact that we wanted to go out. Because the system was so resilient to all the interventions that we made that we could not really change the behavior of the system. On the other hand, so obviously this is not a desired resilience. Similarly, sometimes we find that there are many other systems we participate in where we try very hard to intervene, but there is no change. And it is there where we want to bring about change. On the other hand, there may be some systems where you are happy that there is no change despite intervention. So when you experience harmony, when you experience love, you experience care, you experience, things going well, and despite different interventions or one of the participating actors not doing things that you expect, even then, if the system continues to trust you, to be able to generate the same behavior that it did before, then you are actually in a position where you want that system to be resilient. So it's obvious that not all resilience is desirable, but some resilience is definitely desirable. So the values that we hold dear are the ones which actually reinforce or drive resilience. How does that happen? I think Bert will probably deal with our worldviews and maybe talk a little bit about values, but I think I want to just briefly touch upon this and explain that it's our values that decide what we use to measure what behavior we experience in each of our systems. So for example, we may measure the income that we earn to decide whether we are successful, the wealth that we accumulate to decide where we are successful. This is a part of our value system. Other cultures might actually choose the friendships that you make in your life to decide how successful you are. Others may decide the harmony that you create to decide how successful you are or how good the community is. So the values decide the kind of indicators we have and how we reinforce the feedbacks that exist in the system that ensure the behavior that we desire. So if you want to change resilience, the values would probably need to change. Unless the values in the system change, we are unlikely to be able to change the resilience of a system. So I think in Hungary you have experienced a lot of invasions, and I think Dennis Meadows listed out a few of them earlier. So right from the Mongols to the Ottomans to the Austrians and the Germans and the Soviets, different value systems have invaded Hungary. But what you have managed to keep as your core values despite all these invasions is what makes you resilient. It is that which ensures that that which you value is what you will be able to preserve. That is what will serve as a set of indicators that drive the feedbacks in the system and reinforce the culture and the life that you will have in different systems that you experience. On the other hand, those values which got lost as a consequence of these invasions caused the change that you experience and the resilience to be lost. So I think one needs to recognize this link between the values and the way in which we create resilient systems. So when we have multiple actors in a system, multiple people who have come together for their purposes, it's not always that they actually come together for the same purpose. But when they do come together for the same purpose, as children come together for a common purpose of just having fun or enjoying, then you find that there is much more harmony. Resilient systems usually have actors who come together with a common purpose. When there are different purposes, then you would often find that there is disharmony in the systems that we experience. So actors who share values find common purposes far more easily. If we do not share values, then it's unlikely that we will find common purposes, because purposes are born out of the value systems that we hold and the worldviews that we really have. And so when values change, resilience and systems experience change. So you will find that as the older you grow, the more you feel a yearning for people of your own generation. And that's one of the ways in which you will realize that that's because you share not only memories, but more importantly, you share the same value systems. And when we talk about generation gaps and different values that exist in different generations, it is an indicator that, it is difficult to engage because you are using different indicators and different feedbacks which drive the systems. The purposes of those who interact from different value systems is very different. And therefore, we often experience conflict or stress in those systems. Finally, it's important to recognize that resilience offers us a way to recognize value that does not change so easily. So it's important that systems are not that are not resilient have changing values. So when values change very rapidly or values change, then the system may not be that resilient. So we all experience, I just showed you pictures to remind you about these interactions that we have in our day-to-day lives, which you have, I have, and we hardly notice them or talk about them as independent systems. We usually just talk about the world around us as changing. We just say that, my country has changed, my city has changed, or people have changed. We do not recognize the block or unit called systems. When we recognize this unit called systems, it becomes possible for us to ask, where is the change happening? It becomes possible for us to ask, why is this change happening? It becomes possible for us to ask, where can I intervene and how can I make a difference? So I go back to the question that I asked Donella Meadows in 1986, when I asked her, what are the systems that we can intervene in order to make a difference to the world, to our common home, as you pointed out earlier. It's important to recognize that we can make a difference if we can recognize these systems of which we are a part. If we cannot recognize these systems of which we are a part, and we cannot recognize what are the values that are driving the purposes that brought us together in these interactions, and are these purposes going to result in systems which are fair, which are just, which are going to lead us into the future that is good for all and which is going to be sustainable? Are these going to create resilient pathways for us to go through? So I think it's extremely important for us to be able to use our third eye in order to recognize that I am not I. I am part of each system that I am a part of. Our identity comes from the systems that we participate in. It's important to recognize that the whole of the parts is larger than the sum of the parts. And when we recognize that we together can make a difference, I think we can truly ensure that we can move this world to become a different planet and leave a better planet for the generations to come. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Thank you very much for patiently listening to me.
Anupam, for pointing out the central importance of the values which are guiding systems before and over and above structural features or technical features of them. Looking at the clock, any questions right now? I'm reminded of the intervention possibilities on systems, again by Donella Meadows, which you are alluring to, where we have a 12th grade possibility of influencing systems, and the biggest leverage was exactly what you said, the changing the values of the actors of the system, and the cumulative values the system is serving, basically. I would decide, since there are at the moment no questions from the audience, and we have the panel at the end of the conference, I would suggest to break for a quick coffee break now, and then come back together. I'm looking at the schedule here. We are a little bit running behind time, but yeah, 45. Okay, quarter to 4. We would continue our proceedings, and this gives you a chance to contemplate what you already heard. Thanks. Please, this is for real. We are about to continue our poking into the questions of sustainability, resilience, what it is, how to approach it, how to get it, how to solidify these features in our society. And until now, we were talking about people and people only in a very deep way, but there's a world out there, and it's time to widen our perspective and have a look at nature and how nature and humans and their interaction can contribute to the eco-social resilience. And here I have the pleasure to ask my friend László Pintér, who is wearing many hats, worked at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada. I mean, you're still a member there, fellow, and professor at the CEU, and also importantly, a long-standing member of the Global Environmental Outlook team, which is faithfully reporting again and again, reminding us again and again on the status of the global environment and the trends which you can absorb or observe, and which are not very well rosy. But this talk is about resilience building possibilities through nature-based solutions. Last talk, please.
I'm a runner, and I haven't had a run for 3 days, so I have to walk around. And I think it's better anyway for making connections with the audience. So thank you very much for the invitation, and it's nice to be back. I've had the fortune to speak here before, and I was trying to remember about the topic. Other than sustainability, which is a huge topic, and I think it was actually on indicators, which was, so I've been sort of weaving my way through a number of topics over the last now 30 plus years with respect to this big question, and the reason that this memory was activated was because of Justine's mention that when she worked in Namibia on indicator systems as a high leverage intervention in national policy and planning and decision making, and then someone, I think in the audience, asked the question, did it make a difference? Was it internalized? He said, no, not really. And then, I had to remember that the indicator system initiative I talked about last time, a few years ago, which we started in 2000, it was officially adopted by City Council in Winnipeg, Canada, last year. So it took 20 years. It got there. For one town, I mean, how does this reflect on sustainability and resilience? It basically shows that sometimes there's a disconnect between the urgency we have to change and respond and our ability, including institutional ability, to actually perceive urgency and even perceive the need for having diagnostic systems at the community level or other levels that we actually need to understand, to provide the diagnosis and to understand where we are. Anyway, I mean, that was just a side thought, but what I'm going to say a few words about this afternoon is more recent work. Somehow, I mean, we worked, of course, on global level, national level, and so on. But I very often I find we are converging at the community level, and we also observed, I think, or at least that's my observation, that many members even in the Balaton group who are global thinkers, modelers, and so on, and other members could comment on that. Are also somewhere in their portfolio of interests, also are converging around issues related to community building, and I think that's an important scale, and perhaps even more important at the stage of this transition trajectory where we already are or will be very soon, depending on how you look. So this is focused on the community scale, focused on broadly speaking, cities. Of course, cities can go from anywhere between 50,000 up to whatever, 20 million. I don't know where we stand with the biggest ones right now, and it's going to be a little more practical. But I also kind of sneaked in a couple of conceptual slides about resilience theory. I wasn't sure, we didn't have like a grand plan of who's going to talk. I think Anupam's talk was extremely philosophical, and I was just ready to leave and think for a month. Basically, it was fantastic. But I will have a couple of conceptual slides. First, I will talk about this idea, what I just call disrupting cities with nature, taking stock, learning from, and the inspiration through examples, some practical examples, and then looking forward in terms of visioning and planning, and then sustaining momentum. So first, I mean, just to get the logic, so urban transformations. Well, cities can collapse, and we have, and when you think about images of collapsed cities, sometimes images like abandoned cities, something like this comes up. But in reality, in history, this is more like the way cities that collapsed look like. So they become playgrounds of nature again. So nature does take the city back. What you don't see in this, well, there are no tourists. Normally, I think in Angkor Wat there would be probably 200 tourists in this picture. So there are no tourists now. But of course, people are missing. Of course, there are other types of urban transformations, and in sort of the current climate and broader limits trajectory, we have a lot of these types of transformations where you have extreme events. Our ideal worlds of abode, settlements that intrude into marginal areas of nature without protection, basically they get destroyed. And then there's a question, is that the only way to encounter nature in cities? And some people started to think, well, actually not, because nature can be, we don't need to fight nature. We can live with nature. This is not a new idea, so none of this is not going to be, a revolutionary talk. Yet, even though we understand that living with nature and living in peace with nature in symbiotic forms is beneficial for the grand purposes of sustainability and resilience, it doesn't happen. It's accidental, and therefore we are not really making the most use of it. And that might count when we are actually encountering risks, new types of risks, old types of risks, that where nature could actually be helpful. So that's where the sort of nature-based solutions idea, which I referred to, has been translated into Hungarian, I think, as természetalapú megoldások. It's new, new wine in an old bottle or old wine in a new bottle. I don't know. So this is, but anyway, it's new terminology. Now, so to link back to resilience theory, as Anupam said, you know, many of you are probably familiar with some of these, and I don't have a lot of theory here, but I just thought it would be good to put in a few slides. What we have here in general systems terms is something we can consider an attractor of a complex system. And of course, in this case, the system would be considered as a city that functions and its normal mode of operation. And oops, I'll go back for a second. And we can consider that if this system is experiencing significant risk, let's say a city experiences disasters or technology-driven or externally enforced change, then at some point it reaches a critical threshold, and then we get a bifurcation, and it ends up being something completely different, like, for instance, Angkor Wat at some point being a fully functioning human settlement, and now it's basically an abandoned city plus tourists. So it is possible from these complex systems to flip from one state to another, and resilience can be thought of as an ability to maintain the stability or dynamic stability of that system in what we can call as an attractor. Basically, a city having this ability to take risk, take hits, but live with the consequences and bounce back to its normal conditions. And of course, that has a lot of conditions. So, and what the message will be that that natural infrastructure can actually help this capacity of a city to deal with these types of stresses and risks. So, in order to make a city more resilient, we can think of disruptive technologies, and very often disruptive technologies are thought of, in these engineering terms like that, but or extremes like this from Singapore, but. Actually, the point I'm going to make is we don't need to think about Star Wars and everything. Like, disruptive technologies can be extremely simple. Like Justine was talking about, starting a community garden. Many of you will have dogs. I mean, when you get a dog, it can be extremely disruptive to the family. So when we systematically introduce living components into a constructed urban environment with concrete and steel and glass and metal, we are introducing not just another object. We are introducing life cycles and materials cycles, psychological other elements that will influence our psychology. So it is highly disruptive in good and bad ways. I mean, not bad ways, but challenging ways. That's a local. Actually, I'm being a bit local hero here. This is from Veszprém. So there are all kinds of new experiments. Now back for a second, just for one slide, to theory. So the question in this afternoon is, how is sustainability and resilience linked? So if we imagine this as a development trajectory, for instance, of a community, there can be different options and different pathways of this community to develop in a high-tech style, high growth, intensive growth style, or a more human-friendly or more nature-friendly style. And in each of those paths, there could be internal resilience, basically, for a while. But the point is, if the system follows this type of an intensive growth trajectory, even though it is resilient within this path and its elements are individually resilient, you can have companies that maintain their resilience, their organizations, but collectively they could cross a critical boundary and then face basically a crisis when the system bounces from one base of attraction to another. It becomes something different, and it won't deliver according to our expectations, the same services, the same quality of life as before. Whereas if it follows other trajectories and it's aware of these critical boundaries in terms of resource availability and flows and the way pollution is treated, as Anupam also referred to, then it might be able to navigate dynamically its trajectory, and with many resilient and components, whether those are companies or organizations or down to the family unit. So, okay, one last theoretical diagram that is an old one actually, but I quite like, and I think it's actually quite relevant at this time when we are thinking about not just limits to growth, the anniversary, but where we are in that transition process that limits to growth actually projected. And of course, it projected that at some point, if we don't change, then we're going to hit this this sort of narrow part of the transition curve, and on this natural step diagram by Carl-Henri Robert says, well, the margin of action narrows in this middle part. In fact, the risk is if sustainable supply is not enough to meet sustainable demand at some point, which is a possibility, it is happening, energy markets and so on, then we get into significant trouble. And the good thing about this is that it shows that this is a process, and if we navigate this process well and manage the supply side, demand side with more agility, then it should be possible, hopefully, to avoid the crunch. Okay, so now I'm really going back to the nature-based solutions in cities, and I'll say a few words about this potentially disruptive and transformative solution. It's based on a project that we finished very recently. Actually, it's more than one. It's a series of projects. It's also called Naturevation, and you can look this up. So the assumption was that that nature is, or the potential use of nature in cities is very significant, but we are not taking advantage of it. So very often, this is the normal type of urban gray infrastructure, and I have Pishti Bodor here somewhere in the audience, the manager of the IKEA Green Roof. He's very familiar with these types of settings. So this could be, for him, this is a new normal. This could be a new normal, and it's not. So why isn't this a new normal? So we were interested in this project, first of all, in taking stock. And there is a standard terminology and language for different types of this urban green infrastructure. And I'm not going to list them all. There's nothing surprising here. Maybe the last one is a bit surprising. Even abandoned urban areas that nature basically took over have value for biodiversity. And some associated ecosystem services, and all the others, they can be planned and constructed. They all involve social capital, human involvement. They all require investment. They require planning. They have legal implications. So we thought it would be worth looking at the conditions that can make these types of infrastructure elements not just accidental, but actually purposeful to deal with problems. So we have concepts like ecosystem services that ecosystem provide to society, generally speaking, and then there's also a library of effects. I mean, we don't just do green infrastructure for its own value. Of course, a flower itself has existence value because it's beautiful. But there's a range of impacts, including impacts for economic development, human health and well-being, social justice, cohesion, governance, environmental quality improvements, water management, climate, and of course biodiversity benefits. So again, this is a fairly standard classification of impacts that we adopted from other projects. And then we collected these a number of examples, like this one. I think I could go online. You can look up this database. This happens to be in Singapore, where they had this long canal in the middle of the city that's totally separate, cut the community in two halves, no access from one side to the other, plus just a straight concrete channel. And then the community decided to basically make this, again, a living part of the urban fabric, and actually also bridge the two communities, literally a bridge. And now it became, again, a living ecosystem. But it doesn't have to be so fancy. So this is an example from our neighborhood, right? School gardens. So again, I told you that the classification of nature-based solutions was fairly wide. So for instance, education is an important function, and school gardens are important, both from the education perspective and also later on potentially for local food security. Is that a resilience issue? Sure enough. If our, if prices keep going up, you will see a lot of people starting to grow their own potatoes and other types of vegetables. So kids should know this. This is a resilience skill and resilience capacity. So again, we looked at examples like that, and we actually looked at 1,200 examples like that globally. So in 100 European cities, we have compiled a detailed profile for a large number of such initiatives. It's again, you can look this up, and this for now is the most, and by a long stretch, the most extensive database of this kind on urban nature-based solutions. And you can, why is this interesting? Of course, there are inspiring examples all around the world, and they are interesting to look at one by one. But first of all, we were interested in general patterns of success and failure in terms of how these are conceived, how these are managed, how these are financed, what are the technologies involved, who's running them, who benefits, and what are the types of benefits. So we looked at a whole library of their, collected all kinds of literature on them, so brought together the evidence, and it's all in the profile. So once you have this type of an information, we could start looking for patterns of, again, success and failure and practice. There is, of course, a search engine built into that, and even a recommendation engine that we did with Delft University. So just a couple of very simple numbers from this database. So it shows the types of nature-based solutions that were listed, parks, and again, these are fairly common categories: parks and urban green areas, gray infrastructure with green features, blue areas, that is water bodies in cities, allotments and community gardens, external building greens, green areas for water management, indoor areas, and derelict areas. So again, of course, there are many areas like this in every city. Our search criteria was to look for cases where there was a purpose in their planning and in their implementation. They didn't just happen. There was an explicit purpose on the part of the developer, whether a public sector or a private sector developer or a community group, to create a system there with recognized benefits. Now, there are other examples. I think I'm showing two others. This is from Poland, from Białystok, and it's an example of, actually this is, it is still being developed, therapy through horticulture. So we found a lot of very interesting examples where urban nature is used to to either treat medical conditions or to improve mental health of people of all age classes. Then this is an example from Colombia. Vertical garden, there are many such examples, and of course we also see more and more of these. Then we also try to understand how these contribute to these broader categories associated with climate change and biodiversity. So there is an interest in how urban nature can contribute to mitigation, either by reducing energy needs. When you develop a green wall, green roof, if it's done properly, it can reduce energy needs significantly. Then, of course, it can also embody carbon. Adaptation is a big issue, especially in those parts of the world where flash floods are a significant problem. I mean, in big deal in China, China has many mega cities. They invested centrally in massive projects to reduce flash flooding by building permeable surfaces. Many cities still don't do that, so that's a fairly sort of common sense intervention. Coastal protection is also important because of sea level rise. Then nature, bringing nature into the city, both for education, but also, if you have community gardens, you will need pollinators. So we will need insect diversity. Then improving air quality and so on. And then, as I mentioned already, there are many links to human well-being. In the statistics related to these 1,200 cases, we found that usually they identified citizens and community groups as the most important audience, local government, but also businesses, of course, universities, and so on. But essentially, these types of urban green infrastructures will provide benefits to everyone. These are public benefits. That's of course tricky because very often the cost of developing them is associated with one organization, but the benefit is broadly distributed. These are the types of challenges that we wanted to associate them with the SDGs. Of course, the SDGs have been primarily developed by governments, but they are also taken on increasingly by communities and cities. So it is relevant, and again, based on the statistics in the database, we found these clear references to a wide range of SDGs, from biodiversity as green space, like SDG 14, to health and well-being, land use and urban development, and so on. We also looked at impacts related to climate and biodiversity, and in terms of climate change impacts, we found that protection against flooding was the most frequently mentioned. As I said, again, certain regions of the world, including here in Budapest, this is a significant issue. You can deal with some of these impacts through engineering means, but also through natural infrastructure, stormwater management, lowered local temperature. We all know that urban heat island problems are becoming more and more severe, and so on. So in terms of biodiversity, then just simply providing habitat was important, conservation and restoration of ecosystems, and so on. These are all interlinked components, basically, that were separately mentioned. And then the last thing is impact on health and community. We wanted to know what are the types of impacts on human health and well-being. So recreation and exercise was most frequently mentioned, improved physical health, mental health, then access to urban green space, people's connection to nature, opportunities for social interaction. So those are some of the big categories. Okay, so we have this big database. We looked at the landscape. We try to understand patterns of impact, patterns of successful or not so successful management, and that itself can have value in terms of inspiring people. But we wanted to go a step further and actually help create a tool to visualize neighborhoods with a systematically integrated nature. Now, this was based on a number of assumptions. If you just look at this diagram here, it's actually linked to what I mentioned before. So the cost of developing these nature-based infrastructures is usually the same, usually higher than the benefits any one actor will get from it. But given that multiple actors will benefit from it, the cumulative benefits are actually higher than the cost. So we thought that it would be, given that the benefits are distributed across many actors, it would be important for to have tools where actors can sit together and collaboratively start thinking about what type of nature-based solutions they want. We also realized that there were different business models. So again, if different actors, companies, local civil society groups, local government sit together and consider their options, they usually use different logic to rationalize why they want to invest in or why they want to work with nature-based solutions. They might be interested in reducing risk related to, for instance, extreme events, local stewardship, green densification. So in some cities where you have more sort of thinly distributed settlement patterns, green health, improving health and well-being of citizens, urban offsetting. Let's say if one part of the city is turned into an industrial zone, then another part of the city can, as an offset, it would need to be developed as a green and natural habitat. What happens with vacant space? Education, creating school gardens, for instance, or green heritage. So if you have historic parks and so on. So there are different types of logic that are used to rationalize these planning efforts. But again, it's driven by someone, but it usually involves different types of stakeholders. Now, how working together can be difficult. And so again, going back to that tool, that's why we thought that it would be useful to have a tool that is so simple that it enables different types of people with different levels of expertise to work out a set of solutions. And I'll come back to this. So we created what we call the Urban Nature Explorer, and programmed it from scratch. Again, it's also available freely. And what it does, as one goes through this, through a planning process, first, I have you have your planning area. It's an entire city, or it's part of a city, or a couple of buildings. The scale varies. And within that context, one starts thinking about sustainability challenges. Once you have identified what the most important challenges are, you can think about sustainability goals and targets, and then associate nature-based solutions with those targets. And then there's a question of what kind of impacts will this lead to. So this tool that we developed, and this shows you Dunakapu Square in Győr, but this is more like just a game. So this is a real, this is a fully functional piece of software. So what happens here is that This map, in the background, it represents a part of a city, and in the background, we coded in all realistic possibilities for a full library of nature-based solutions that are shown here on the left. So for instance, if you want to build a green wall, and you pick a green wall, then it will activate that planning layer of the city where a green wall actually makes sense. You cannot put a green wall in the middle of a road, right? So, and the map will know that. And then you can pick another type of green infrastructure element which activates another layer. So it's basically a smart planning tool that associates with possibility, with the choice of a green infrastructure element. That's one thing. So that can be done very simply by all kinds of experts and non-experts. And when that is, as that is done, again, in the background, an impact model calculates the impacts of putting one tree or 2 trees or 10 trees or a lake on the target variable that has been selected. So if I want to reduce flood risk, and one puts installs a surface runoff, like runoff control structure, then it will reduce flood risk, and that impact will be shown based on the calculation of an impact model on this indicator. So one can play around with this tool, not just in a visual term, but in a way that you get an indicative indication of the impacts, plus also the costs. I didn't mention costs. We also have a cost function here that can be, of course, customized to any given location or country or city. We have used this tool so far in one site in Hungary, one in Austria, and one in Uruguay. And so it's basically fully functional. It's not perfect, but we had very good feedback from people because, again, what we wanted is to help develop visions, positive visions of solutions in a way that is practical, that is site-specific, and basically that can excite people in a way that they are willing to go to the next more technical stages of a planning process. Okay, so that's how far we got. I think I'm probably getting close to my 40 minutes. So just some closing thoughts, and this is about how to move beyond, because we had to realize at some point, our project came to an end. And what happens at the end of these big projects is you publish papers and put results on a shelf, and they are forgotten in 5 years. We didn't want to do that because there was quite a bit of interest to continue. So, but we had no organizational structure to do that. So we created a little startup with our innovation laboratory at the university, Physi.Earth, and that's where we basically want to continue doing both research and maybe services. Okay, so this is my last slide, I think, and just some closing thoughts on nature-based solutions in communities, how to use them to enhance resilience. One is what I called entrenching the culture of care, and as Anupam mentioned, in systems are defined by relationships between members of the community, for instance. And of course, what we are talking about here is not just members of the community as you and I as human beings. It's you and I plus nature. So we depend on nature fundamentally. And when we think about care as caring for each other as humans, we also have to care about nature in terms of its life functions. And that's a mutually beneficial relationship. So by introducing these types of elements systematically into the urban form, that requires rethinking basically how we run our communities. That will need capacity. That will need new types of insights. It's already there. We have groups that take care of the urban parks and so on. But if we create enriched parks, if we create more green roofs and so on, that will require additional capacities that also reflect this value of care and develop symbiosis. Then capacity for virality. What I meant on that is that, of course, with NBS we created a language, which is almost like I could probably consider it a meme, like in memetics. As memes, as we know, can spread fast, but those are just ideas. Here we actually have practices. So you have an idea, and there are practices behind this idea that many think actually have much more value. But we need to find ways to think about the capacities needed and how can these solutions, if they really are solutions, be recognized and internalized, not as parachuting in from outside. I mean, I think we are past that point where we should kind of develop other people's life, But how can you lead people on a learning journey and the discovery of their own needs and own capacities where they recognize the value of these types of solutions? And that could perhaps create virality to speed up this positive transition. Then enhancement and maintenance of latent potential. As I mentioned at the beginning, that our hypothesis is that nature in cities is accidental. It's either there historically, or it's just a result of some convenient sort of architectural type planning, and that's not enough. So there could be more, and that real potential, could be brought out through inspiring examples, through helping the planning process, through creating policy mechanisms that actually incentivize the development of such solutions. And then use the potential and power of design. It's not just building something. It has to be built in a way or grown in a way that actually makes it the most sense for people to use. So it might not be enough to create an urban forest. You have to make it accessible for people and kids of all age groups. And then last point is evidence of impact. What we found in our survey is that many of these initiatives, actually, they use this rhetoric that, we will develop some green infrastructure, it will be good for you. And that's not really strong enough. There has to be some evidence that when you put forward that claim, actually there is something behind it. When we also worked with the European Investment Bank, and the EIBs already indicated that they have an interest in financing more infrastructure development, but for them, sort of for the business case, there has to be more evidence of impact. So for that, you need monitoring and you need better data. You will never get perfect data. That's not what we are talking about, but there has to be sufficient evidence to make the business case. And I think that's my last thought. And we had a whole range of partners in the project and continuing the work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. I mean, the why, the what, the how, and the where of nature-based solutions, if we wanted to get into concrete terms here, we have, as a minimum, two very, very concrete tools, and we can go back to talking about them and how to use them. So I'm sure people would be interested. But before that, before having this final round of informal discussions, so to speak, with you and among ourselves, let us just come back to the initial question, to Denis's thoughts and to the problem around which we are all dancing. So is sustainability dead? Is resilience alive? Is this a trajectory? How should we place these thoughts? Did they take a different form now after 50 years of first having those warning signs? And I asked our good friend Bert Ries to talk us about that. Bert has a very distinguished university career behind him. I would say he wrote the definite textbook on sustainability science. Sorry for saying that, Bert, but that's my honest opinion. I think sustainability science became a science with the Cambridge textbook of Bert, and that did not exclude advisory work for governments. So there is a very wide view, or horizon from which you are speaking to us. Let alone the fact that he's coming from a very green town in Netherlands, Utrecht. So there's the local touch and the global touch. So Bert, please, you have the floor.
So thank you, Janus, for the introduction. I will be maybe the most scientific after the three previous ones, which for some people may mean that it's quite boring, and for other people that it has a certain status. So what I will do is, I need also this distance point. Yes, so limits to growth plus 50 is the proper title for today, and then we linked it to resilience, and we are still ourselves in the process of figuring out what it really means, how all of a sudden this somewhat more fashionable idea of resilience is connected to sustainability. Now, this is just briefly about what I did in the past. The point is, all I want to say is that I have been modeling this kind of work. We also did do scenario and climate change research for the IPCC. And as Janus mentioned, I'm also writing now the second edition of the Sustainability Science book. And the main reason I'm doing this is that I think having education on a real integrative approach of the various topics is at the moment very important. So, having said this, I give you just this simple quote up there. Are we running into limits? Well, we recently had in the Netherlands a new government, and we have 3 ministers, and 50 years ago it would have been unimaginable that we would have a Minister of Economic Affairs and Climate. We now have a Minister of Climate and Energy, and we have a Minister for Nature and Nitrogen. And I'm not making a joke here. I mean, you may think I make a joke, but it isn't. Well, someone will not get me. So what I will do is, it will stop soon, I hope. First, I present some global regional modeling projects, very briefly. There were 3 targets and image. They all belong to the category of integrated assessment models, and officially this is the kind of work which science is doing to support the IPCC and other UN bodies. And then secondly, I will introduce the worldview framework, which connects possibly this kind of scientific work to some of the previous presentations. Now, I'm not going to go in any detail of the modeling. Normally, I don't know how many people here do mathematical modeling, but normally you write equations and then you usually lose 90% of your audience. You also can use Stella software, which means that you have, for example, stocks and flows and relationships. So you visualize the relationships in your model, and then you lose usually only 80% of the audience. And I'm here just showing to you that this is the kind of modeling which is behind the World 3 model. This is actually part of the World 3 model. This is the industrial sector. The previous one was the population sector with 4 stocks of people at different ages. This one is the service capital sector. So how is a model now being constructed and run? Well, basically, the model was connecting these different submodels, like population, industrial capital, service capital. You then have this integrated model, and the computer starts to simulate on the basis of all the relations you have put in. And then you get beautiful outcomes like this, which were, of course, in 1972, really magic. I mean, I myself did physics, and my thesis was done on a computer which was from here to there at 360 kilobyte. So it's hardly imaginable how fast we have been improving. But in 1972, this was magic coming out of a computer. And it suggested, as you can see here, that over the past, up to the red line, we had growth in population, we had depletion of non-renewable resources, we were producing food, we were producing industrial stuff, and we had also pollution. And the basic message of limits to growth was that this could not continue, and you only have to do this to show that in the business as usual presentation, it could not continue. And in fact, the message at the time was in the business as usual scenario that it would collapse. And usually I tell my students the collapse will happen on the 21st of February 2027. And I always hope that most of them will not believe the exactness. There is this famous joke about someone in a museum. Some of you may know it, that you are visiting and then the visitor sees a huge skeleton of a dinosaur. And it says 16 million and 16 million years plus 15. So the visitor asks, why do you know it with so much accuracy that it's 16 million years plus 15? And the provost says, well, because when I came here, that was 15 years ago. It's this kind of accuracy which you should not expect here. Now, the essence of this model is that you have 3 models which already in the 70s were more or less conventional modeling: population, economy. I mean, you can have a lot of critique about several of these models, but the real contribution from World 3 at the time was that they said, okay, this is happening in a world which has finite resources and a finite environment to absorb pollution. So if you do that, then you see that the natural resource depletion and the environmental degradation become part of your larger model. And especially then, if you have feedbacks from the depletion and from the degradation to the provision of food, to the service sector, which takes care of health and education, then you have a more integrated model, which is the essence of the World 3 model. And Anupam mentioned it already also, that this is the real value. And the business usual model, the scenario in the upper left, was later on in the book, which is also translated in Hungarian, with a few more scenarios, in total 10. And why did Dennis Meadows and some colleagues make these other scenarios? Well, for a simple reason, because the business usual scenario suggests that there will be collapse. But of course, immediately you had some people who said, yes, that's because you suppose we have not enough resources. But what happens if we have 2 times more resources? Well, then you do the calculation, And somewhat unexpectedly for most people is that you then actually run into more problems, but only a little bit later. And the reason is obvious, because you now can go on the wrong trajectory a little bit longer. Then someone said, well, you're too pessimistic about technology. I mean, we become much smarter. We make cleaner technology. We become more productive in resource use. So that scenario you can also put in, of course. And then you are also in a situation where you may be too long on the correct trajectory. Now, what some people, including Turner and Harrington, did is look at the 4 scenarios shown here, which is the business usual one, the business usual 2, which has 2 times more resources, the CT, which is comprehensive technology, which is more optimistic about technology, and the sustainable welfare, which is the one in which you stabilize, probably with help of a couple of dictators, the population and the industrial output. These are 4 out of a total of 10 scenarios in the book here. And what is interesting, I think, in this recent discussion we had, and I also joined the discussion in the Netherlands we had a few months ago, what is interesting is that 2 of those 4 scenarios are almost certainly not happening, almost 0 probability. And I think you would agree with me that those 2 is the upper left, or is there anyone who thinks that we are really now within 5 years collapsing? No one. The other one is sustainable well-being. That means that the population will stabilize within, let's say, 5 years from now. Anyone who thinks this will happen? Okay, so it seems there is already quite some agreement here that 2 out of these 4 scenarios will not happen. Then we are left with 2 other ones, which are the lower left and the upper right. That means 2 times more resources and comprehensive technologies. The reality at this moment is, if you believe in the model, which I actually don't do, but it's nice to have an illustration. If you believe in the model, follow the model, then the situation is that we are somewhere, in my view, in between. Because we do have more resources than we thought in the 70s. I mean, they were too pessimistic. We do have more technological performance than we thought in the 70s, especially thanks to China, I have to say. So we are somewhere in between the upper right and the lower left scenario, if you were to ask me, do you believe any of these scenarios at all? Now, I have 3 points of criticism about the model limits to growth. It has 3 important positive impacts and a few negative impacts. The first one is it introduced the notions of positive and negative feedbacks and delays, which was at the time a real revelation. Most models had no feedbacks whatsoever, and this was a time, some of you will remember, that we had famous books on cybernetics. So this was the first time people started to realize how complex the real world is. Almost nothing in the real world is linear, whereas all economic models, for instance, used to be linear. So that was a great contribution. The second contribution is that the model did not suggest that markets would solve everything. In fact, the World 3 model has a very rigid investment allocation. That means the decision how much to invest in industry, services, food, energy, materials is quite rigid. And on the one hand, this is a disadvantage, but on the other hand, it explains the extreme, almost violent response from American economists. Because in the American economic circles, the market is the thing which will govern the world. and it will also govern the world correctly. So the whole idea that you actually have this planning paradigm implicitly in the World 3 model is something which was really, to many American economists, a reason to oppose everything in the World 3 model. And if you reread the history, you can see that these were really violent discussions, almost physically violent. And I think that's an interesting aspect, because if you think about the role of the United Nations and the MDGs and the SDGs, if we are not having, at least up to a point, a planning paradigm, then what kind of expectation you have? Do you really think that we can solve, let's say, some of the big challenges without planning and really leave it to the market? I mean, you must be very naive if you think that that's the way the world works. The last point, which I think is a contribution, is that they provided a platform in the form of a model, a computer model, which now made it possible to discuss big controversies. For instance, the question about how many resources do we have? Or for instance, the question, how much progress we make in using materials and energy and in improving our environmental performance. So these are all, I think, reasons to respect and appreciate this model. Of course, I also have quite some critiques, and just very briefly, one is the role of markets and technology is underrated, in the sense that if you look carefully at history, for instance, you see that you do have these two loops, the population loop and the capital loop, but those who study history, let's say the last 400, 500 years of industrial development, realize that, for example, it's very important whether a country is developing literacy, so there is a basis for education and science. It's also very important if a country is able to build up sewage systems, medical services, for which you need the public provisions, which usually a government will provide. So these things, and whether they are by markets or technology or by governments, have to be included in a serious model. And they are not really in the World 3 model, and they are also not in many other models. So that is where we make much improvement over the last 50 years. A second critique is the World 3 model is too aggregate to be useful. That was a big claim at the time. You can't use a model which describes the whole world with one number for the world population. And I think we make massive progress on this. Our models nowadays have much more detail. And I just want to show you how important the detail is, because a colleague of mine made an assessment of the type of farmers in the world. And there are a number of categories here. You see survivalist farmers, eco-agriculturalists, professional intensifiers. But why is this relevant? Well, it shows that if you describe the world food system with a simple, single aggregate farmer who has only one way of, let's say, farming, I mean, don't expect that this is going to help us. It was nice to discuss it 50 years ago, but of course, I mean, don't expect that we can solve seriously what's going on by discussing the thing at that level. So we have to disaggregate, and that's what we are doing now in the big models to a large degree. And thirdly, there was a widely used claim that the World 3 model is technocratic. Especially social scientists felt that it was very technocratic, also philosophers, and I think they had a point. So one of the things I'll briefly discuss is a model which we made. It's called the targets model, because what we try to do is, apart from introducing more explicitly roles of prices and technology, and more explicitly introducing space, we also introduced values. And how did we do this? Well, I have to go very fast, but we did it like 15, 20 years ago. And we made an extended model, like the World 3 model, but much larger. And we introduced something called the cultural theory. Some of you may know about it. It is work by Michael Thompson, Aaron Wildavsky, and some other people. And the essence of the theory is that you have ways of perceiving society which can be arranged along two axes: strong group versus weak group, and strong grid versus weak grid. And these schemes are just a representation of how someone perceives the situation he, she, or the world is in. And you can see that the perception then here is at the lower left that we are living in a robust world. Yes, climate is just not very sensitive. You can move around and it will be robust. Whereas on the other hand, this will be the rugged American entrepreneur, and on the other hand you have the Greenpeace person who says that actually the world is a very unstable place, and if you move a little bit too far above 1.5 degrees, for example, the whole thing may go down the drain. And none of the two can prove they're right. It's really a perception, an interpretation, a belief about the world. And similarly, up there you have the hierarchist and the fatalist. I have to go fast. And what I wanted to show you, anyway, the presentation can be sent to people if they want to see more details. Because what we did then is we introduced power and values into the use of the model. So we said, okay, suppose you have a management style, which means who is in charge, who has the power. And we also said, how does the world really work? What is the real dynamics going on in the world? And if you do this, you get three what we call utopias. Because the whole exercise now is, suppose that the individualist, which is, for example, a big corporation who believes that the world basically is robust, suppose they are in charge. Then, of course, if it turns out that the world is really very robust, climate is not really changing, I mean, 2 degrees, fine, no problem. Then you have an individualist utopia. Similarly, the egalitarians, Greenpeace, for example, will be very happy if the climate is very sensitive and they are in power, and therefore introduce a high carbon tax. And what we then did is say, okay, you have these utopias, but you also have dystopias. And I have to go fast, I said already, but let me show you one dystopia, which we know quite well, which is that the corporations have the power, and corporations, I mean big multinational corporations with the support of many governments. And Greenpeace is right about the world. I mean, then you have a combination in which you actually have greedy, short-term people, CEOs, financial markets, running a world which actually is very sensitive to, for example, carbon emissions. And then you have something which comes close, in fact, to the Club of Rome business as usual scenario. And we reproduce that scenario with our model, and you see that then, of course, the collapse is a bit later, so let's say the 5th of June 2063, but it's still there. I mean, you still have now, in this dystopian future, this clash between those who are in charge and who make the decisions on the one hand, and those who have correctly seen the climate and other parts of the environment as very sensitive. So this was one way to introduce values into the whole debate. And I'm telling you this because it shows that the World 3 gave an excellent start towards more comprehensive and integrative model-based approaches. We then, after this model, worked for about 10 years, and it's still being used now on the image model. I have to go fast again here. It's a huge array of models at several universities. In my case, mostly at Utrecht University. Integrated model to assess the global environment, etc., etc. This is still being used as one of the 6 global change models for the IPCC. I'm showing you this because this is now kind of state-of-the-art modeling, and we have learned from the World 3 model. So since the 90s, we say it's fine to have a model, but what you should do is use the model in connection with a storyline, with a narrative. So what you do then is a little bit what I showed in the previous model. You have a certain idea about how the world will develop, or might develop, and then you choose the parameters in your model in such a way that it fits the narrative. So if the narrative is that basically you should be very optimistic, then we put in high learning rates for technology in the model. And then you create something which you might call a utopia or a consistent scenario. You may also create, of course, dystopias by saying, okay, I can't learn very fast because there are wars. Besides, some other obstacles make it difficult. So what I'm saying is try to connect the model with a narrative. And the outcome is then called a scenario. And when we were making these scenarios for the IPCC, we had 2 dimensions, which meant that we basically constructed 4 storylines, 4 narratives. And they were along 2 dimensions, regional versus global, and sustainable equity versus material wealth. And we made then system dynamics mental maps behind it. I realized I'm going very fast, so I hope you don't care, because my point is really not to go into the details, but to understand the idea that we use system dynamics to make a consistent mental map which belonged to that particular story. For example, this particular story, B2, is one in which you have a focus on the region, and the region, the people in the region, want to focus on sustainability and equity. Very idealistic scenario, you might say, although, for instance, Laszlo's talk is, in a way, very much along these lines. Initiatives at a small scale directed towards sustainability and equity. So that's what we did. And if you do this, then you can find a number of books which usually belong to these storylines. I mean, typically you have books like this. And just to give you one illustration what it means if you start doing the modeling work, this is work by a PhD student of mine. What we said is, suppose you have this high growth world run by corporate business. Then you have a lot of globalization. But if you have much globalization, you also have fast transfer of technology. For example, China will then quickly learn, as they did. And that means that your potential for solar and wind energy, and also biomass, will actually be quite big. The point is, you also have high energy growth, because you have such a fast economic growth. So as a fraction of total energy, renewables may be still small, but in absolute terms, you have a bright future, and a windy future too. If you do this same exercise for the world which is not globalizing, which is instead focusing on the regions, because globalization somehow failed, as it is doing right now, up to a point. And if you then have a world which is not focusing on sustainability and equity, but really focuses on survival in material terms, yes? Trying to get enough food, enough energy. Just watch the news these days. It's about energy. You see that the potential for solar and wind energy is then much lower. So you have more people, but the prospects for renewables are much less. Why? Because technology is disseminating much slower. And as a consequence, you have higher cost for these options. So this is the kind of application we now make with the models in combination with the narratives. And the most recent work in the IPCC done with this and other models is that we have, again, 2 new dimensions in the whole game, you might say, which is now order the narratives according to the challenge the future will be in terms of adaptation, and the challenge it will be in terms of mitigation, very much focused on climate change. I guess most of you are familiar with the distinction between adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation goes in the direction of resilience. It means you have to adapt. Mitigation means you try to reduce the emissions. You see that you then can have different storylines. For example, if the challenge is very much to adaptation and it's very small in terms of mitigation, you have a different storyline than when the opposite is the case. And usually there is a middle-of-the-road one. This, again, I have to go fast, but these are the outcomes. You see that then the whole group of modelers, 6 teams again, 7 teams again, came up with a number of population scenarios. You see that you have the green line, where population actually at 8.2 billion people will start to decline. But you also have the red line, in which population, it's still one of the UN projections, possible outcomes, goes to 12 billion people. If that happens, then you can also combine it with estimates of economic growth. Personally, I think the whole idea of GDP growth until 2100 is silly anyway, but it's widely used. All official estimates do this, exponential growth of GDP. So then you see that you have one of those scenarios, the one which is red, is combining these 12 billion people with a relatively low material wealth. Because in a non-globalizing world, you will not have very much economic growth. In fact, India and China will start to use their coal, for instance, in a massive way. The green scenario is the one where you have less people. They have higher economic growth because they're more successful economically, and therefore you see that they have, in total, a higher GDP. So these are now the 2 main scenarios the last couple of years in the IPCC discussions on climate change. And if you look then at the outcomes, you see that you have 2 different lines for the emissions of CO2. Because the green line is now the successful line. The green line is the beautiful line. We become rich, and we have only less than 8 billion people by the end of the century. I mean, we all dream of this world. And I can tell you, I don't know how many of you believe that this is a serious possibility. Not all at once. Okay, no one even. You see, it's a beautiful future if it were to happen. And let's be honest, if this is going to happen, we don't have to discuss resilience. I mean, we are not in danger, so why worry about resilience? Of course, because no one of us believes that this will become the truth, many of us fear, oops, I should go the other way. Many of us fear that the red curve may be the one, which means that we have 10, 12 billion people who are relatively poor, and even apart from migration, they will create massive CO2 emissions, if only because India and China, for instance, have to use their own coal because they need energy. Well, in this case, I would recommend all of us to think about resilience, because in this future, we will need it. So that's, in fact, the first part of my talk. Now, the end of this part of my talk, and I'll make it not too long, 5 more minutes, because the end of part of this talk is, of course, we probably have to think about resilience, because the possibility of the red curve is non-zero. How many of you think actually that the red curve has a serious probability? So So it's a storyline which is still possible, that we really have over 10 billion people, that they really will not be able or willing to mitigate emissions to acceptable levels. So most of the scenarios in the IPCC are now in the middle range and unfortunately point at 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase. I don't show you all the outcomes, you can look it up at the IPCC reports. So the middle range suggests we go to 2.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. And if this happens, it makes sense to think about resilience. Now, that's the second. I'll go fast again, but this is one of the graphs which was already in the first limits to growth. I adapted it slightly. And what it says is something we all are very familiar with, which is basically all of us live in the here and now. Yes, just here, this room, at this moment. And as soon as you go to larger scales in space and time, many of us tend to say, okay, very important, we should discuss it, but right now I have to go home because I still have to buy food or take care of the children. So there is this tendency to discuss the world later, elsewhere, but it's not your first preference. As soon as there's crisis, especially, you tend to go to the here and now. So the question then is, how are we combining this personal attitude, which is so human, with the fact that we have to realize some collective goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals. I like personally this one, which is there in Dutch, but it's a cartoon where he says, can you please stop saying all people are different? And the idea is, of course, that diversity is beautiful, but at the same time, if you really want to run the world in a certain direction, for example, less CO2 emissions, more adaptation, or just summarizing all the Sustainable Development Goals, you need diversity, but not too much. So if that's the case, then what you can do, there are many ways which you could go. One way to go is to introduce values, and that's what we did in the Sustainability Outlook in the Netherlands in 2004, where we did a number of surveys and we said, okay, if we ask people about their values, what will come out? And we found, for example, that there are two dimensions which show up and which were also showing up in other surveys, which is this tension between I, me, myself, think of iPhone, iMac, yes, and on the other hand, the collective, the other. And the other dimension is that we feel that you have, let's say, a worldly achievement, which is usually quite material. Income is an important indicator, versus the more non-worldly ideals, which sometimes are quite conservative. They may have to do with religion, tradition. So we found that this is important. We also then said values is one thing, but beliefs, which are very closely related to values, are also important. So usually I show my students these 4 archetypes if you are on a birthday party and you discuss the future of the world, which is a favorite topic actually on birthday parties. And if you do this, just briefly, then what you will see is some people see this exponential growth and just think it's possible, forever almost. Many people have a more realistic idea. There will be a ceiling. At some point, it simply will start to level off, which we all have as an everyday experience. Then you have the optimist, who will give examples where humanity is so smart that we were lifting the ceiling all the time. And it's true that by inventing ways to make fertilizer from nitrogen in the air, humanity has been able to lift the ceiling for people from, let's say, 2.5 billion to the present 7-8 billion. So we are really smart. Maybe it will cost us a lot that we are so smart, but we are smart. And then you have, of course, the pessimist. This would be the corporate leader, especially the one who's selling fertilizer, for instance. And this is the Greenpeace pessimist who said, yes, But in doing this, you're actually eroding the very carrying capacity of the planet. For instance, by destroying biodiversity, by depleting all your resources, by polluting the water and the air, etc. And these four archetypical mental maps you can almost always recognize, at least during a birthday party conversation. So, what we then said is, maybe we can introduce world views, combinations of values and beliefs, according to those same dimensions, which you find back throughout philosophy and throughout the social sciences, which is this tension or dimension between the small world, the I, the particular, versus the big world, the collective, the universal. And the other dimension, the material, the bodily, versus the immaterial and the mental, spiritual. And if you do this, you can give it different names, as we did, and you can associate it with various icons. And you might say in the middle is the agora, as it used to be in ancient Greece. So again, I have to go very fast because normally this is a course of 6 weeks. So what you can do then is, for each of those worldviews, you see them up there, and this is what I also try to communicate in this textbook. You can, for each of those worldviews, formulate certain values, certain motivations, certain beliefs, indicators, policy mechanisms, and in fact there it links also to what Anupam was saying about systems. So if you do this, then you realize that there is actually not a single solution, and that's maybe the key point in the whole worldview approach. We probably are only going to solve these so-called global problems or sustainable development problems or whatever you call them if we recognize the diversity which exists in the circumstances of people, in the values of people, in the beliefs of people, and then you realize, no, there is not one solution. You cannot expect that the problems will be solved if we all go to the A1 world, where you have a couple of billionaires who say that geoengineering is going to solve the problem. I mean, it's fine that we have billionaires. They may have or may not have deserved this money, but it doesn't mean that they now, because they have that much money, have the right to start introducing geoengineering options which affect all of us in ways which we don't understand. We even don't understand, neither do they, whether they will actually solve any problem at all. So here you see a typical example that if you go to the extremes, like this A1 extreme of geoengineering, you are not going to solve the problem. I'm convinced that that's not the way to go. The way to go is to use this worldview framework as a heuristic tool and start to look at solutions which fit in the different worldviews. And what you see then is that indeed some of those corporate-oriented worldviews will play a role for sure. We need better batteries, for instance, and usually those batteries will not come from the local shop. It's almost certain they will come from one probably Chinese multinational corporation, whatever. But you also need all the inputs from, for instance, what Laszlo was talking about, organic farming, recycling, local systems, including even personal growth, meditation. You also need a more collective spiritual orientation or religious orientation where the churches are playing a role. And I think a perfect example is what was already mentioned, which is the encyclic of the Pope, which is indeed for many people an important moral anchoring in the whole debate. And for many people, his message may be more important than the latest news about, let's say, the profits on new batteries. So if this is an approach, then You can even link it to ethics, but I will go fast here. Our view is that, in fact, if you go to the extremes, like the example I gave of geoengineering, but I could give other examples like the Inquisition in medieval Europe, or extreme consumerism in the 90s, or maybe sectarian control in the B2 future, or the corporate state in the A1 future. If you go to those extremes, you probably will not be able to find sustainable development. You're pretty sure, by the way, to be able to start wars. So for military companies, for example, is it quite okay? So we think polarization is not a good idea. And there's a beautiful statement by Oscar Wilde which expresses this: decadence is a subordination of the whole to the parts. And that's what's happening if you go to the extremes. And therefore we advocate something, I advocate something, which is try to search for the middle ground, try to search for the center, and there, probably in the center, you find a dialogue about the different propositions from the different corners of worldview space. And I think personally that that's where we should be heading for. And I think I'll leave it to this, because my other remarks are somewhat technical about resilience. And well, if you send out a PDF, those of you who are interested, you can have a look at it. So, thank you.
I think we might as well leave off the last slide. Might be a good idea. Can I ask you to come forward for a few minutes, Bert, as well, please, because here we still have a little time to contemplate what we have heard this afternoon. Thank you all very much. My question first is to the audience. I did not open it up for questions after last and Bert's presentation. So, are there any questions to the speakers? There was quite a lot of information here. Because if not, then I would just abuse your presence and patience for a little while, and in a way push you back in the last exchange to the title question of this session, because we have approached these issues like sustainability and resilience from very different angles, and we have looked at very different aspects and approaches to it. So, is this question we didn't touch though, or maybe then I missed it. But I think we didn't touch the title per se. So is it an either or? Is it an and? Is resilience the new sustainability? What do we think about these issues? Because after all, this community also is engaged in sustainable development, sustainability, stability, and so we are in this tension of having held sustainability as some sort of a goal, a situation, a status, a condition which we want to achieve. We want to rest in a sustainable situation, reach it, so to speak. That's many of us professional, in a way, efforts are in the service of that. So are we giving this up? Is resilience a tool for that? Are we exchanging sustainability for resilience? So if you could quickly just give us a few thoughts about that before we go home and contemplate that. And we could ask the views from the audience as well, if you would be willing to offer any answers to this not so easy question. But I mean, I would in a way we will have the chance in these circles to continue this. I will rather bounce it back to you. Anup.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question that you ask. When we are looking at sustainability for the last 50 years and now we are talking about resilience, so how do the two really relate? And I think a lot depends on what lens we put on and how we approach what we are trying to sustain. And I think from a systems perspective, what we really are trying to sustain is the interactions we have with the world around us, as we have known it during our lives. So essentially, it's also possible to define this in a different way. And the different way would be to say that, do I have resources in order to continue my lifestyle? When we look at it from that materialistic way, where we say that I need to have resources to continue with my lifestyle, my approach to the problem is going to be very different from when I start saying that I need to relate to the world around me, to the people around me, to the other species around me in this world, in a way whereby I can recognize that we are together a whole. And together we make the planet come alive. And I don't know, many of you may be knowing of James Lovelock's work, where he regarded the planet Earth as Gaia, as a living being, where all of us are actually creating an environment that makes it livable for life on Earth. So I think sustainability from that lens really means that we are sustaining our relationships. And resilience really means that if we find ourselves in a system which does not show change in behavior, so how we experience the system, so we find it as unjust or we find it as just, we find it as something which is exploitative or coercive, and we want to change it and we are not able to change it, then it may be resilient. Or if it is a harmonious system and we cannot change, a dictator comes along and wants to destroy it and cannot change it, then it is resilient. So resilience per se is a property of the relationship that we have in the system. And it depends on, sometimes it is good and sometimes it is not good. So per se, resilience is not something which has to be good or has to be bad. Whereas the same is true about sustaining a relationship. Some relationships you may not want to sustain, and others you may want to sustain. So that's my perspective.
I mean, I can add to that. I mean, to me, from the perspective of sustainability, the important point is that I don't think even in the mind of those who, at least those who put the sustainable development as a concept on the table, it was seen as a static endpoint. It was seen more as a learning process, and to me, the idea of navigation has always been a useful way to encapsulate the learning that is involved in sort of quote unquote the journey, which includes association between those who are in the boat, like the cartoon that Bert showed. That how do you associate? How do you form common direction, sense of purpose? What's realistic? How far are you from the left side? How far are you from the right side? That the narrows that you saw on the diagram from the natural step, and in that type of ability to navigate narrows and perceive what the boundaries are, rethink what is realistic as a target, even if you have high ideals as whatever your collective or individual well-being and you know, in spiritual fulfillment and so on, sort of including the material aspects. I think this ability to navigate, I think that does imply resilience to me, because it means you navigate in a resilient way between the narrows. And those narrows, I mean, that was sort of just a footnote I had to some of Bird's figures, is that particularly the emission curves, is that, and I know these are represented in the model, but I think our knowledge about sort of the non-human emissions is still fairly limited. Emissions from the tundra and the ground ice and clatrates and so on and so on. So, you know, you might end up in a situation where the guardrails are actually happening, and they are at this stage because of delays in the system, are almost unrelated to it. They're happening because of what we've done 30 years ago and not because what we are doing today. So that could, and those are big unknowns, so those could sort of further narrow the path, and therefore navigation and resilience in an even narrower path could become even more important.
Yeah, one remark about what you just said. Yes, in the IPC reports, there are detailed uncertainty estimates because there is a lot of ignorance still. So all we can hope for is that this is roughly indicating the spread in emissions, and therefore we can roughly estimate the amount of warming, and hopefully we can, with some certainty, say something about all the possible feedback mechanisms, which may actually give us feedback loops which may make the situation less serious or make the situation much more serious. But coming back to your question, my personal view is to stick to the word sustainable development more than sustainability, because the fact is that we have 3 to 4 billion people, human beings, who aspire for a more decent life. And especially now that on their phones, because many of them have a smartphone, even the poor ones, they see every day the lifestyle of the rich. So for them, it becomes really a way of expecting such a life. So we are all working to give half of the human population the idea that our Western lifestyle is what they should aspire and what they even can expect. Whereas the real message of everything we are talking about today is that this is not going to happen. This will simply not happen. It's impossible. But the message is not coming through because we sell them this lifestyle in a massive scale, including messages like the US President Bush, who said in Copenhagen, the American lifestyle is not negotiable. So on the one hand, we sell this, and on the other hand, we are not willing to say that if we take these messages serious, what we discussed this afternoon, we, and especially the West, especially the rich countries in the West, including, of course, some Middle East countries, should simply stop wasting resources, polluting the environment to the extent they do. We don't want to give up the present level of affluence. We even don't want to give up most of our governments, and apparently also most of our people, to have growth, to have increase. When I was making scenarios for the Dutch government 10, 15 years ago, we still, and I think it's still the case, had to assume that the average Dutch citizen will be twice as rich by 2040, 2 times richer. And then what they say is, yes, but we also have the Africans in the scenario, and they become 5 times richer. Well, of course, if you only have $1,000 income per year, and you go to 5,000, that's 5 times. But if you have already 30,000, and you go 2 times, you add 30,000. So we are still playing this game with respect to the rest of the world. And as long as you are not taking this into consideration, the whole topic of being resilient may just be, let's say, a hobby of some of the well-paid academicians or NGOs. And I'm a bit skeptical here. So I think it's very important work, but at the same time, I think, yes, resilience is an important part of the debate. As I have shown, in my view, it's always contextual. So if we go for the 2.5 degrees Celsius because we are unable to solve what's going to unfold in terms of climate change, there will be many places where we will have to adapt and where people should take then smart adaptation strategies, which means resilience. But even there, the rich promised hundreds of billions, and we didn't give it to them. No, sorry, we now have this concern about COVID. Or, sorry, we now have this gas problem with Russian gas. So as long as this is going on, we should just be honest enough to say that many of the things are just not taken seriously. And this is a pity, but it sometimes is what worries me most. Because we have one scenario, you may have seen this, A2 scenario, which is actually the worst possible scenario, which I sometimes see partly happening, which is that the rich people at some point say, well, we or our populations are not going to change because they choose right-wing populist leaders or corporate leaders who go for economic growth. So the only option we have is make sure that we, rich people, protect ourselves against climate change. And that's what some billionaires are already doing, just purchasing a lot of land in New Zealand and make sure that you survive. Now this, of course, is a real nightmare in many ways, because that means that you have given up solidarity. It means that you basically see human beings as to be dismissed if they are poor. So that's my biggest concern.
Thank you very much. Now, we never promised to solve these questions this afternoon. What we promised to was to give you some food for thought and, in a way, to share the thinking of this group of our friends, of our colleagues, with this wider audience in Hungary. And what we can only hope is that there will be reverberations and repercussions in this audience and longer discussions and probably a lot of action. So what really remains to me is to thank, first of all, really wholeheartedly to my colleagues, Bert, Anupam, Laszlo, Justine, for prolonging your stay and delaying your travels back to your beloved ones and offering this time for all of us. And also a heartfelt thank you for all the colleagues of mine who helped to arrange and bring together this meeting this afternoon, including the House of Dialogue staff. Thank you very much for your very professional work, and our friends from the 72 Disciples movement. One more comment about the book, which has been mentioned many times. If it comes back to your mind as Christmas is nearing, that maybe other people might need it, or whether it would make a good present, I'm just revealing this secret that if you go through the T72 channel instead of the official bookshops, then there is a very big discount on it. So should you require further copies, then just get in touch with us before. I mean, this is just an advice, very economical advice, that get in touch with us before you hit a bookshop. So thank you again very much. Thanks for coming. I was really very happy to see this crowd. I was trying to share with our presenters from the list of participants of who you are and what a very interesting and very powerful audience this has been. Thank you very much for coming, and maybe see you again sometime around the same theme at the same place. Good night and thanks very, very much.